You ever heard the claim that the Exodus is just a myth? It's just made up. There's no history. There's no history to prove it. There's no archaeology that supports it. It's just some fanciful tale of imagination that never actually occurred in reality. Well, I was curious. So let's take a look at how much actual evidence in history there is out there to support it and see if we can change some people's minds. All right, welcome back, everybody. So, as part of my apologetics Bible study that I do in my church, we are sometimes we focus on cosmological arguments or theological arguments, and recently we've gone into a sort of historical evidence-based lesson series. So it started off in Genesis, and I got asked to teach one of the lessons, so I thought one of the things that would be interesting to look at is the history and archaeology for Israel in Egypt and the Exodus. So primarily, we're going to look at what historical evidence and archaeological evidence exists out there from Genesis chapter 40, Joseph basically being in Egypt, all the way through the Israelites' Exodus and their time at Mount Sinai. See if there's any really good direct evidence, and also take a look at all the circumstantial evidence and put the whole case together and just see how compelling that evidentiary case is. So kind of the agenda for the discussion would be starting off in Genesis. So we'll be looking at the Avaris archaeological excavations, some of the Semitic statues they found in Egypt in this region, some of the grain storage facilities that archaeology has found, take a look historically at some of what we know about Middle Kingdom politics, and then also the Brooklyn Papyrus. And then as far as the Exodus, take a look at the Pharaoh of Exodus, Amenhotep II, and why we're pretty sure that is the right Pharaoh. Weben-Senu, his son. Take a look at the historical accuracy of the plagues versus Egyptian gods and how that ties into the Pure Papyrus, the Dream Stele. Take a look at what evidence there is that we can see around Mount Sinai despite the restrictions to archaeology there. The Merneptah Stele, the Soleb inscriptions, and then the Tomb of the Patriarchs. So right off the bat, the first thing that we see, there's been extensive archaeological excavations done around Avaris. So Avaris there, just south of Tanis, kind of in that fertile delta region. And we'll see why this region in particular aligns with Genesis 40 to 50. So as we understand the timeline, we believe, Joseph arrived in Egypt sometimes around 1800 BC, and the Exodus itself would have been sometime around 1400 BC. So this period between 18 and 1400 is what's generally known as the Second Intermediate Period. So this period is characterized by a lot of different changes. You have Egyptian rulers, then you have the Hyksos dynasty that comes in for about 150 years that dominates the region, all the way through around 1400 BC when it leave. And we see during this period, in the period between 1700 and 1550, according to the Archaeology, there's an influx of Semitic immigrants, and that transformed this particular region into Canaanite-style cities and regions. So why is that interesting? Because Avaris is basically biblical Goshen. And as we remember from Genesis 40 to 50, when Joseph had his family brought into Egypt, the Pharaoh gave them the Goshen region because that was a area suitable to herdsmen, and herdsmen were detestable to the Egyptians. So they didn't want them really anywhere near their major capitals, but they gave them this particular fertile delta region as good land for their pasturing their animals and so on. So this probably happened under Sesostris II, best we can gather from Egyptian timelines and where we think Joseph probably lived, when he probably lived. And then also the archaeological excavations through the course of time here, we can see tombs shifting slowly from wealthy Semitic tombs to poor mass burials. And this is interesting because it aligns with the biblical kind of narrative that initially, Joseph and his family were very successful. He was a vizier or a ruling authority. It's likely that for a while, some of his other family members would also occupy positions of importance. And then perhaps when the Hyksos dynasty came in, is when you see the narrative of, a pharaoh arose in Egypt that no longer remembered Joseph and started to oppress and enslave the Israelites in the region. So while none of this is particularly proof, of course, it is all very compelling circumstantial evidence that aligns with what we see in the archaeology. And then also, we see a sudden abandonment from the archaeology around 1446 BC, and the abandonment is not accompanied by violent traces. So this also lines up significantly well with the Genesis narrative of Pharaoh ultimately giving in and letting Moses and his people go, and the entire region was abandoned, by potentially as many as 2 million people abandoning the region. So in these excavations as well, they found very interesting things in these Semitic tombs, and one of them is this 6.5 foot tall colossal statue depicted here in 3D. And what was interesting about this is they found it in what was obviously a very wealthy, prominent tomb of a Semitic vizier. And this statue, they did recover of it, did have what appeared to be kind of a multicolored cloak on. And you can see kind of the head here, this mushroom-shaped hat, as sort of a dead giveaway for a Semitic individual. And also, interestingly, no body was recovered from this tomb. So why is that interesting? Well, according to the biblical narrative, Joseph's bones were taken with the Israelites when they left. So potentially, maybe, possibly, this could have been, the tomb of Joseph. No way to prove it, of course. It's not like Joseph's name was anywhere in the tomb or anything like that. But, the circumstantial evidence around it is interesting. A Semitic 6 foot tall colossal depicting a very important individual in a wealthy tomb with a multicolored robe and missing bones. All aligns pretty well. Can't prove it, but pretty interesting circumstantial evidence. Then we also see from the archaeological excavations these grain storage facilities at Avaris. So these are interesting key archaeological feature that underscores the city's role as a major economic and administrative hub during the Middle Bronze Age from 1800 to 1550. Also aligns with the story of Joseph and his vision of 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So we see this region becoming central to the storing up of grain. So we can see from the archaeology that revealed that the grain storage evolved from simple pits early in the Middle Kingdom to around 1700 a more sophisticated silo system, which theoretically would align with the story of Joseph and his taking over responsibility for preparing for the 7 years of famine. So these facilities match Genesis 41's description of centralized storage under a Semitic vizier, and also the Semitic statues give evidence to the rise of power, aligning with patriarchal timelines, and so on and so forth. So again, we see some, very interesting circumstantial evidence that points to an alignment with the Genesis 40 to 50 narrative. Now, what do we know about the Middle Kingdom politics that would also kind of align with Genesis 40 to 50? So in this particular period of time, we see a period of an increasing centralization of power and wealth, which supports the plausibility of a Semitic figure like Joseph wielding significant authority in a system designed to manage resources. So think about what Joseph did. Joseph was running like a real racket when you think about it. I probably would not have agreed with Joseph's politics, but he spent 7 years taxing everybody in the region to store up all that grain. Then when the famine hit, everybody who eventually ran out of food had to come to him for food, and he made them pay him for the taxes that they already gave. And once they ran out of money, they had to give him all the cattle and livestock. So all of this stuff is following under the umbrella of Pharaoh. So now Pharaoh has all the food, he's got all the money, he's got all the livestock, and eventually he's got all the land, because people were forced to give it up in these harsh famine conditions. So in the 12th dynasty, we see Pharaoh's like, Amenemhet I and Sesostris III, consolidating power even further, moving the capital to, I'm going to say this word wrong, but Itij Tawi for strategic control of the Delta and Upper Egypt. Sesostris abolished the nomarch autonomy, replacing them with state-appointed officials, creating a bureaucratic hierarchy. So basically, prior to this time, the pharaoh was a strong figure, but he didn't control Egypt with complete authority, complete autonomy. It wasn't until after this kind of period of centralization, when he took some power away from some of these regional leaders, aligning with this idea that everybody had to give up all their land and their resources and everything, and all came under pharaoh exclusively, that we see this in rapid, I don't want to say rapid, but we see this significant centralization of power under the pharaoh himself. So the taxation and the wealth redistribution, the crown imposing these taxes funneled to royal coffers, and the Reisner papyri documented labor and resource allocation reflecting a command economy. So there's this transformation in Middle Kingdom politics towards this strong centralized authority under the pharaoh that was different than what we had seen prior to this, and aligns with that kind of narrative of Joseph essentially taking control of a resource allocation in Egypt. So then we also see this Brooklyn papyrus. So there's been plenty of claims out there that there's no evidence even of Semitic people being in Egypt at this time. No evidence whatsoever except for this Brooklyn papyrus. So this ancient document from the 13th dynasty, somewhere between 1800 and 1650, discovered in Thebes, is notable because it contains a number of Semitic slave names. So we have this as evidence of Semitic names being slaves. So there really isn't a whole lot of credibility to the fact that Semitic people weren't in the region at that time. They're just not called Israelites at this time. So this papyrus is primarily just a bureaucratic record of a servant transfer list reassigning 95 domestic workers from one household to another. But in addition to this, we also see at the bottom of the screen here, there's a whole bunch, of tomb paintings that show these kind of orange slave figures, going about the tasks of manual labor, like cooking bread, making bricks, doing manual labor, etc., etc. And these figures are generally understood to be Semitic slaves. So there's a lot of physical evidence out there of Israel, of what would be considered Israelite type people as slaves in Egypt at this time, both the papyrus and paintings on tomb walls. So now that gets us up to 400 years after Joseph. So we've got Joseph and his family settling in Egypt. We got them becoming, wealthy. We got them spreading through this Goshen region, multiplying dramatically. We've got this period where obviously the pharaoh no longer remembers Joseph, possibly the Hyksos, where they start to enslave the people. We see going from rich tombs to poor tombs, and we see Semitic names being associated with slavery, and we see paintings on walls showing Semitic people as slaves. So now we get to Moses, and I'm sure many people have heard Ramses being the name of the pharaoh that supposedly was during the time of Moses. Well, that's almost certainly not correct. So we're pretty confident that Amenhotep II would be the pharaoh of the Exodus, and there are a number of reasons why. So Amenhotep II, being the 7th pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty, ruled from approximately 1427 to 1401 BC, which aligns with the Exodus timeline. So there's two basically possible timelines for the Exodus. There's a 1400 timeline and the 1200 timeline. This 1400 timeline is the one that it aligns with, and from my opinion, this is where most of the evidence aligns. So one of the reasons that we are pretty sure that Amenhotep II is the pharaoh is because his father must have had a long reign. So what do we know from the Genesis and Exodus story is that Moses, after he killed the Egyptian, fled into Midian. And he was in Midian for 40 years. And it wasn't until after he learned that Pharaoh had died that he was ultimately sent back to Egypt. So the father of Thutmose II must have ruled for more than 40 years. And as we understand from Egyptian chronology, he actually reigned for 53 years, which aligns with the biblical story. Also, interestingly, he's about the only pharaoh that reigned long enough to even fit in the timeline, and is the only one in the Middle Kingdom that lines up correctly. So, almost certainly, Thutmose's father was the pharaoh when Moses fled, and Thutmose III, his son, was the pharaoh when Moses came back. But there's more evidence than that. So his tomb, KV 35, is in the Valley of Kings. This was discovered in 1898, and it did contain his mummy and rich grave goods. And it also contained the mummy of his son, Weben-Senu. And we see from both of these pictures here, if you look very closely, you can see that there are a bunch of bumps, pustules, boils, scarring on the skin of Amenhotep II, which is a very interesting feature not found on any other mummy. But if we think about the narrative, Amenhotep II and all of Egypt would have been affected by boils as one of the plagues. So again, while you can't prove that that's what this is, it is very interesting circumstantial evidence that perhaps Amenhotep II was affected by these boils of the plague, and it scarred him permanently for the rest of his life. Also, we see his son Weben-Senu, who we found in the tomb with him. You can see by this image was a boy of somewhere between the age of 10 to 12, who died young, also aligning with the Genesis narrative of the plague killing the firstborn children. So both those things are necessary to be aligned with the biblical narrative, and they both do, according to history and archaeology. And the link that I have here is for a station called Expedition Bible, and he's great. Joel Kramer is the archaeologist. He does a really good entire long video on just these two particular things. So you should definitely go check that out. All right, so now we're going to take a look at how the Bible gets the theology of ancient Egypt correct. So one of the common kind of complaints or pushbacks I've heard about the Old Testament, the Torah wasn't written by Moses. It was written a couple hundred years after him. It was written by scribes, yada, yada, yada. So if that was the case, those scribes would have been far separated from ancient Egypt, living in the land of Canaan. And kind of the intricacies of the assault that Moses and Yahweh put on the gods of Egypt would be very, very suspect for them to get all the details right. But as we go through this, we kind of see very clearly all the plagues that Moses rains down on Egypt align very well with the theological kind of framework of ancient Egypt at this time, based on what we know about the history and archaeology of Egypt. So the first thing that we see is Moses challenging Pharaoh with the staff and the serpent. Well, why is this the thing that he's doing first? Like, what is the point of this? And what we see here really is that Moses is challenging the god Wadjet. So this is the most likely the deity confronted, as her cobra form symbolized Pharaoh's divine protection and Egypt's sovereignty. So we see the statuette here of Wadjet and the cobra-headed disc. So this would have been the very first god that Moses assaulted. So Aaron's serpent, consuming the magician's serpents, undermines Wadjet's protective power, showing Yahweh's superiority over Pharaoh's divine authority. So this would align with the broader narrative of God judging Egypt's gods. And that's really what the plagues are very strongly about. The plagues are judgments on Egyptians' God, and we're going to take a look how each one of those lines with that. So the next one, is the blood, the Nile turning to blood. So water turned to blood in Exodus 7:14-24. So the effect, of course, was the Nile and all the water sources turned to blood, killing fish and making water undrinkable. So the god confronted here would be Hapi, the god of the Nile's inundation, responsible for fertility and life. So the thing that gave Egypt an advantage over all of her ancient cultures was the reliability of the flooding of the Nile. That's why it was thought of as the breadbasket of the ancient world, because they didn't have to rely on rain for their crops to grow. They knew that every year the Nile was going to flood for, I think it was a mile or two on either side of the banks, enriching the soil and making their harvests of grain and other things very reliable and very rich, and making them very wealthy and stable as a society. So the significance then of turning the Nile, Egypt's lifeline, turning it into death is a way of showing Yahweh's control over these life-giving waters and undermining Hapi's authority. Then we have the plague of the frogs. Frogs overrun Egypt, invading homes and sacred spaces. The god confronted here would be Heket, the frog-headed god of fertility, childbirth, and resurrection. So frogs were a symbol of life in ancient Egypt, and making them a pestilence was a mocking of Heket's role in creation and fertility. Then we get the plague of gnats and lice. So the effect being that dust becomes gnats or lice, afflicting people and animals, tormenting them. And the god being confronted here would be Geb, who is the god of the earth, from whose domain dust arises, and Khepri, the beetle-headed god of creation and renewal, also possibly linked to insects, as he is this beetle head. It's an interesting looking god here. So the significance being, the earth being Geb's domain, producing torment, and the Egyptian priests unable to replicate this plague, admitting it's the finger of God. So Yahweh here exercising his authority over the earth and over all of the things in it, dust, insects, etc., and turning, what should be sort of like life-giving deities over to torment for the Egyptians. And he continues on with this with the flies and swarms. So swarms of flies infest Egypt, but they spare Goshen. Or the region that Israel was in. So the god confronted here would be Khepri again, associated with scarab beetles and insects. And the significance here was Yahweh's selective judgment, sparing Goshen, showing his sovereignty over creation and surpassing the insect-related deities. Then we have livestock. So livestock suffer and die from disease. The plague kills all the cattle and horses and livestock, but again, sparing Israel's. So several gods confronted here, Hathor, Apis, and Ptah. The Hathor being the cow-headed goddess of love and protection, often depicted as a sacred cow. Hathor would be unable to protect the livestock from the plague. Apis, the sacred bull god, the embodiment of fertility and strength. His strength couldn't prevent them from dying from the plague. And then Ptah, the creator god linked to Apis. So these significant sacred animals that were central to Egyptian worship die, proving Yahweh's power over life and fertility. Then we get to the boils. Sores and boils afflicting the Egypts and their magicians, but not, again, Israelites. So the gods confronted here would be their gods of healing. So Sekhmet would be the lioness goddess of healing and plagues, who could inflict disease, but here could not protect the Egyptians from the disease sent by Yahweh. Imhotep, the deified physician god, or god of medicine. None of his medicine could help. And then Isis, the god of magic and healing, invoked for protection. No doubt Isis was repeatedly invoked during the plague of the boils, and none of those things stopped the plague. So Egypt's healing deities fail as Yahweh inflicts these unhealable sores, even on the magicians. Then you get the hail. The hail from Exodus 9, the effect, you get a fiery hailstorms destroying crops and trees and people, but once again, sparing the Israelites in Goshen. So you have your weather gods being confronted here. Nut, Shu, and Tefnut. So Nut being the sky goddess responsible for weather. Shu, the god of air and atmosphere. And Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. So Yahweh controls the heavens, devastating Egypt's agriculture and exposing the impotence of even more deities. So then you get the locusts, which is really interesting. So now we have this situation where Yahweh has taken away the Nile, their source of life. He's taken away the protection from the Pharaoh, from their cobra goddess. He's taken away their cattle. He's humiliated their healing physicians with boils, and now the hail has destroyed most of their crops, and what little is left to the Egyptians, he sends swarms of locusts to consume like everything. So there'd be almost nothing left after the locusts get done with anything that the Egyptians have. They consume the remaining crops and they darken the land. So gods confronted here would be Serapia, Seth, and Min. So Serapia being the protector against locusts, obviously made totally useless. Seth, god associated with storms and chaos, sometimes linked to pest control. And Min, the god of fertility and the harvest being completely destroyed. Yahweh sends locusts to ruin Egypt's food supply, overriding their agricultural deities. Then we get the plague of darkness, 3 days of palpable darkness over Egypt. So this is a direct assault on Ra, the sun god. So Ra is the chief deity of the Egyptians, a symbol of life and order. So not only has Yahweh blocked out the sun god, but he's also made an assault on order, the chaos caused by all of the plagues. No doubt would have been a direct reflection on Ra's inability to maintain order. Now, Horus, the falcon-headed god associated with the sun and sky, closely associated with Ra, would have been also assaulted. And then Atum, the creator god, linked to the setting sun. The fact that there was no sun for 3 days being visibly setting would have been an assault on him. So Yahweh extinguishes Ra's light, proving supremacy over Egypt's most powerful god. And then, of course, we have the firstborn death, the death of the firstborn. So the firstborn of every Egyptian, from pharaoh, slave, livestock, etc., all but Israelites to spare, those at least that did the Passover lamb's blood. And the gods confronted here would be, again, Pharaoh. So we circle back. He started with Pharaoh, confronting his divine protection and authority, and we bring it back to Pharaoh at the end after humiliating all the gods. So Pharaoh, considered a living god whose firstborn death undermines his divine status. Osiris, Anubis, and Min would have all been associated with this issue. Since Osiris is the god of afterlife, protector of life and death, he could not protect the Egyptians from this death. And then Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the dead, would have been very busy after this. And then god of protection, linked to firstborn heirs, Min here would have been rendered impotent. So Yahweh's ultimate judgment strikes Egypt's divine lineage and afterlife beliefs, showing his power over life and death and divine kingship. Now, why did I go through all of those? Other than the fact that they kind of show, uniquely correct understanding of Egyptian theology, which suggests strongly that when it was written by somebody who knew it very well, which Moses would have, and not somebody hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles later who might not have been so closely associated with Egyptian theology. Well, the reason is because of this Epure papyrus. So this Epure papyrus is an ancient hieratic papyrus documented from the late New Kingdom period, specifically in the 19th century. So it is about 250 years possibly written after these events. However, it is entirely possible that such calamities were written into the collective conscious of Egypt, and those calamities would have been associated with, complete disaster for the next couple hundred years, culturally speaking. So what does this papyrus show us? It describes widespread chaos, social upheaval, natural disasters, and moral decay in Egypt. But interestingly, it does it in such a way that it parallels the 10 plagues. And we're going to look at this. So there are proponents out here who say they see this as historical evidence of Exodus 1446 BC for First Kings, aligning with revised chronologies, placing it in the 13th Dynasty's collapse or Hyksos era. The Semitic context ties to Avaris findings, like mass graves and Semitic tombs, suggesting plague-like events. So the proponents see this as something that could point directly to the effects. The 200-year separation, makes that possibly a little bit of a challenge. But this could just be kind of the story that got passed down over the next 200 years. And this just happens to be the piece of papyrus that we have. So what are these parallels? So we see in the Epura papyrus, for example, the river is blood, men shrivel up like horses, the city is bloodied in every way. This aligns directly with the Nile turning to blood and killing fish and causing starvation. Pestilence is throughout the land, grain has perished, no fruit of the fig tree. So this would associate with the livestock plague, hail on the crops, locusts. Fire has gone forth, hail and lightning flash, the storehouses are empty. The hail with fire devastating the fields. No doubt the hail with fire would have burned down, buildings as well. The door has been barred to the stranger. Slaves are the masters. Servants flee with wealth. So this would align with 12:29-36, the death of the firstborn. The Israelite slaves demand Egyptian goods and depart with their wealth. The slaves are the masters. Woe is me because of the misery of this time. Scribes are killed. And, this just aligns with the general theme of darkness and widespread death and chaos at the time. So that is very, very compelling to see a non-biblical source like this that could be some kind of like poetic, license taken by this person a couple hundred years later, but he's writing it down in such a way that it mirrors the events of 250 years ago, probably because in the collective cultural conscience of the Egyptians, they had come to associate calamity with these things in this particular order because of the events of the Exodus. Now, that's all speculation. Obviously, it's all circumstantial, but it is interesting, and it does align with the biblical narrative. Okay, so another piece of archaeological evidence that we have that aligns with the Genesis narrative is the dream stele, so also known as the Sphinx stele. So this stele is in between the paws of the Sphinx there in the Valley of the Pyramids, and it's a granite monument erected by Pharaoh Thutmose IV, who succeeded Amenhotep II. So this would have been erected around 1401 BC. And in it, the Sphinx promises Thutmose IV the throne if he clears the sand from the Sphinx. So this is interesting because it aligns with the unexpected secession. So Thutmose should not have succeeded Amenhotep II because he was not the firstborn son. And it sort of reeks of propaganda in ancient Egypt, right? So with the death of Weben Senu, his succession would have been not challenged exactly, but questioned whether it was sanctioned by the gods. So getting this vision from the Sphinx saying that, he had divine authority given by the Sphinx due to his clearing of the throne, that makes him a legitimate pharaoh. What's also kind of interesting here is to think that the Sphinx was buried by sand at this time. So obviously it's been buried multiple times over the course of its life, but even in 1400 BC, it was completely buried by sand. So now we have Moses and the Israelites leaving Egypt and fleeing into the desert, the wilderness, heading to Mount Sinai. So is there any evidence of this? So this is all tough because the government of Saudi Arabia will not allow archaeological excavations in the area. So a lot of this stuff is like amateur archaeologist or unconfirmed or speculative or whatever, but there is some interesting stuff out there. So this map shows all the possible mountains for the location of Mount Sinai. As you can see, there are not very many options, and most of them make no sense whatsoever. The two that do kind of make sense are Jebel Musa down at the bottom of the peninsula and Jebel Makla, Jebel al-Lawz. Those are the ones that maybe make the most sense. But most likely the Mount Sinai listed here, Jebel Musa, is the right one. But a lot of people think that this blackened peak, a picture of this blackened peak here at Maklis Summit, scorched by black being the only mountaintop that looks like that, evokes the imagery of the fire-covered mountain in Exodus 19 and Deuteronomy 4. While that is interesting, some of the quote-unquote archaeology around Mount Sinai is a little bit more interesting. So the picture here on the left shows kind of looking down from the mountain and things that could possibly be indicators of a large group of people in the area. So we see Moses' altar, which we'll look at in the next slide. Here at the base, this area in the blue here is where possibly water could have been to supply water to the people and the cattle. You've got the 12 potential pillars location, and you've got the golden calf altar location. Now, it is interesting that it is of concern enough to the Saudi government that they're out here throwing big fences around these things. So those big fences around this potential golden calf altar. And it's not confirmed or anything, but as I understand it, supposedly there's claims out there that people found gold dust on top of this thing, which would be interesting if true, because what does the Exodus narrative say? It says when the golden calf was discovered by Moses, they ground it to dust. So perhaps some of that gold dust still remains. And then, of course, you've got the sort of pictographs down here showing cattle, possibly indicating nomads in the region, possibly the Israelites, maybe associated with the golden calf iconography. Hard to say, but it is located in the area. So the Moses altar here is probably the most interesting thing to me. So as you look at this, what it kind of looks like is a cattle pen, right? So you would pass cattle up through the beginning of it, and then at the end here, you would have this like area where they could pass through, and ultimately a sacrificial altar. So if the Israelites were in fact sacrificing animals, you'd want a way to control them, want a way to get them in a controlled way up to the altar where they could be inspected and then ultimately sacrificed. And that's kind of what this looks like here. But again, the Saudi government does not allow archaeological excavations. These pictures were taken by amateur archaeologists, so who knows? Then, of course, you have what is speculated as the Rock of Horeb. The illustration here showing what it might have looked like with water flowing out of it. And then, of course, what it looks like in real life. And I have heard, though unsubstantiated, that it does show signs of like water erosion around the rock, which would be interesting. So the last couple kind of things here, we have this Soleb inscription. So this is on a hieroglyphic relief on a granite column from the ruins of the temple of Amun-Ra at Soleb in Nubia. And this is interesting because it may contain a reference to Israel that is contemporary with the Israelites fleeing in the 14th century. So the key term here is this YSRIR. I'm not sure how you would pronounce this. Yisir or Israel, appearing in a list of Shashu of Edom, and it reads something like the Shashu land of Yisir. So if the Yisir is indeed Israel, it places a group by that name in Cana circa 1400 BC during the wilderness wandering, or early Judges post-Exodus. So this would again align with the Exodus narrative and seem to contradict this idea that Israel was never in Egypt, it wasn't even known to Egypt, and they certainly didn't wander in the desert for 40 years before they conquered Canaan. So the Merneptah Stele then is also known as the Israel Stele, is the first clear indication of Israel. And this was put up on this monumental granite inscription by Pharaoh Merneptah, and this was in around 1208 BC. So this would have been about 200-ish years after the Israelites fled Egypt. And it's a mention of Israel as the earliest known reference to this group in any ancient text. So this would align with Israel, establishing itself as something of a nation within a couple hundred years after their their flight of Egypt. Mostly this stele just commemorates Merneptah's victories, but it also includes a section of his conquests in Canaan. And this would have been during the early Judges period of Israel. And the last thing here I just throw in because it's kind of interesting. We talked about Joseph, his bones being taken out of Egypt when they fled. And most likely the place that he would have wound up would be in this tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron in the West Bank. It's the traditional burial place of the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs, going all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, etc., and possibly Joseph. There exists a current enclosure today built by Herod the Great, circa 20 BC. So a long-standing tradition of, going all the way back to, I think, at least 1000 BC of like this particular site being, a place known to the Israelites, a place of pilgrimage, etc. And obviously, for obvious reasons, there have been virtually no exploration, some limited, some 12th century monks reports. In 1981, there's an Israeli probe that did confirm underground chambers with blocked passageways. So most likely this is, in fact, a burial place. And if it is, in fact, correct, then it would be the place where Joseph's bones have most likely been laid. So this has been kind of all the history and archaeology associated with this idea of Israel being established in Egypt, growing up into a large community, ultimately being oppressed and put into slavery, the evidence of them sort of rising up and being able to flee from Egypt and ultimately establishing themselves around Mount Sinai before ultimately going on to conquer the region of Canaan. So, there's I've heard a lot of arguments out there saying, oh, there's just no evidence to support that any of that stuff ever happened. And yet, while none of this stuff is necessarily direct evidence, the circumstantial case for it is very, very strong. And it's if you are just kind of overlooking all of this stuff and refusing to acknowledge its significance, then I think you're doing yourself a disservice. So anyway, I love this history stuff. Hopefully you guys learned something new. And God bless.